This is Mark Lundholm here. I'm the climate change lead for NWSOFA. Normally, we have our meetings the fourth Tuesday of the month, but Representative Casten is usually busy in the second half of the month. So when we found out Jeff Pressman and Palatine Cool Cities could get you on now, we decided to partner our June event with you. And Bill, do you want to say some brief things about NWSOFA for people who don't know about us? Indivisible. Yep.
Would love to. Always like to get an opportunity to give a plug here. NWSOFA stands for the Northwest Suburbs Organizing for Action, and we are one of 6,000 indivisible chapters across the country. We are located in the 6 townships in the land beyond O'Hare. That includes Elk Grove and Schaumburg and up through Barrington and Palatine and Arlington Heights, Wheeling. So it's a large area. We have about 5,000 members within that group, and we're organized into 9 issue groups. One of those issue groups is climate change. And an interesting story is the first time I ever met Sean Casten was when he attended, it may have been a gun violence prevention meeting of our group. And he talked about that and climate change. And I thought, this guy just may be able to do the unthinkable and get rid of Peter Roskam.
Yay!
and here we are. So anyway, it's great. And Mark Lundholm has been handling the climate change and has been working really close with the various local organizations like the Palatine Cool Cities and Barrington groups. And so it's really, really great to have Sean on and all of you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Mark. I'm Jeff Cressman. I and my wife co-founded Palatine Cool Cities Environmental Team. We're longtime residents of Palatine, and we just decided it was time to get more environmental awareness and action in our community. And we have managed to work somewhat with the village. We're happy that we kind of pestered them repeatedly, and they've agreed to start textile recycling recently. And we're trying to raise their awareness of other issues. And we're working a lot with other groups such as the Palatine League of Women Voters, Friends of Deer Grove, Sierra Club, and other organizations, as well as NWSOFA. So, and we also were happy to have been part of the League of Women Voters sponsoring a webinar with Sean back in February on transportation transformation, which we touched on a lot of energy issues, which of course impact climate change. So with that, and Sean, I know your time is somewhat limited, and so what we were hoping to do is, I think most of us have a sense of what's going on with the science of climate change. We've heard of the studies and the consensus, and things are in very serious shape, and not getting better. In fact, they're getting worse. And so what we're wondering from you is what's going on in Washington these days, and what hope do we have that we can get some meaningful legislation. I was telling Bill that I was on GovTrack to look at all the bills that are out there, and I saw several dozen that had to do with climate. I saw one by you as well. And I just don't know, I know there's probably a lot of competing bills and so forth, but why don't you tell us exactly what's going on in DC regarding all of this?
Sure. Well, thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Mark. Great to see all of you. I think, Bill, the second time I met you was sitting there in Palatine and getting really, really nerdy on carbon pricing structures. So we'll try to stay away from those details this time. So let me try to give a quick overview and then really move to ideally spend as much time with questions as we can, hear what's on your mind. I think in general, I would describe the situation in Washington right now as that the stars are perfectly aligned with one exception. And I'll get to the exception, but let's just start with the stars that are aligned. We have both chambers in the White House and a commitment to doing something. The Select Committee on the Climate Crisis that I was on last term put together a pretty comprehensive view of what needs to be done, which was largely adopted by the Biden White House, that sort of largely sets their plan. We have not just a president who gets it and a cabinet who gets it, but they've actually organized the cabinet to deal with climate. That's an underappreciated big deal. We know where education policy is done. It's the Department of Education. We know where healthcare policy is done. It's done at HHS. There is no agency responsible for energy policy in the United States government. Some's at DOE, some's at EPA, some is at the Federal Energy Regulatory Committee. And the structure that they've put of having John Kerry as the climate czar overseeing our international activities, Gina McCarthy coordinating the domestic activities, is a really big deal, and we're seeing that benefit. We have a desperate need for infrastructure in the country. We have a president who campaigned on it and has a lot of political capital at stake in getting it done, and a chance to build, the economy of the 21st century, not just repair potholes in the 1950s infrastructure. And then lastly, we have cheap money as far as the eye can see, and that's not an argument for being fiscally irresponsible, but when you have these opportunities to build things that are going to significantly increase our rate of GDP growth, and you can build them with cheap money, should we change tax policy? Should we do things? Of course we should. But we just have a lot of tools and room to maneuver on that. So the stars are pretty well aligned, and at the broadest level, what that means sort of structurally within the larger infrastructure package, which is really going to be the vehicle that things will move in, is number one, at least double our energy efficiency, energy use per dollar of GDP. If we did that, we would be almost to the level that Switzerland already is. So there's no technological barriers. There's no capital barriers. It's just a commitment to getting it done. That makes everything else easier. If we use half as much energy per dollar of GDP, everything you think you know about constraints kind of goes out the window. So that's number one. Number two, we need a huge R&D effort. And this is intentionally number two. There's a ton of underdeployed proven technologies, but we still need an R&D effort, because if we're going to get to zero, as we must on the carbon, we got to figure out how to make steel, how to make cement, how to do aviation, how to do long haul trucking. We just don't have good ways to do those right now without fossil fuel, and that's an R&D challenge. I actually got a bill passed and signed into law by Donald Trump, of all people, last term, to create and stand up an agency in DOE specifically to consolidate that and put $500 million into deployment. Had some good conversations with Secretary Granholm about figuring out how to ramp that up now, but it's a start. Like, we've got the pieces there. And then we get the real hard thing, that we've got to also make a massive investment in negative emissions technology. Your point is right, Jeff, that the science is not comforting. And we need to get back to 350 parts per million, which is basically getting back to 1985 CO2 levels. And that's a hard challenge. And we got to figure out a way to do that. The only real profitable ways to do that are through agricultural solutions. But that's tricky, but we have to do it, right? The last big thing that we have to do that sort of governs all the policies is a recognition that there is always a louder constituency in Washington asking for preservation of the status quo than there is asking for change. And the result of that is that there is much more low-hanging fruit that comes by removing existing barriers than there is from creating new incentives. We subsidize the fossil fuel industry in this country to the tune of $650 billion a year. I don't think anybody thinks there's a political path to create $650 billion a year of subsidies to clean energy. But we could effectively get the same thing if we took some of those existing barriers away. And as I politely tease some of my colleagues across the aisle, who would support subsidizing a failing industry other than a socialist? they take it well. I think it's a teachable moment for them. If all of that sounds like, doubling efficiency, negative emissions technology, removing barriers, if all that sounds like it's politically impossible, well, you're right, but it's scientifically necessary. And, and our challenge, not just me, all of us as humans, our challenge is to close that gap, and it is closing quickly. I told you we had all the stars aligned with one exception. The one exception is the filibuster. And it is a huge problem. And I'm not going to get into all if you want to talk process, I'm happy to get into process. But the structure of the filibuster means that we really, we really only have one bite to get this stuff done in a big comprehensive package done through reconciliation, because there simply is not a bipartisan path to doing what's politically possible, much less what's scientifically necessary. And the cause for that, I think, is primarily a positive cause, but we got to understand the cause, which is that going to a clean economy is going to a cheap economy. It's a massive wealth transfer from energy producers to energy consumers. If you have a solar panel on your roof, you don't pay for electricity anymore. It's pretty sweet. If you have an electric vehicle, you don't pay for gasoline anymore. It's pretty sweet. That means that there's this huge sucking sound taking money out of the parts of our country that extract, produce, refine fossil fuels and giving it to consumers. That's a net gain for the economy. But if you look at where you think of as the blue states and the red states, the blue congressional districts and the red congressional districts, by and large, the Democrats represent the areas where the people are, and the Republicans represent where the land is. And so a wealth transfer from producers to consumers is broadly a wealth transfer from Republican parts of the country to Democratic parts of the country. And that's a hard problem to solve, but I think we will solve it as much as possible to the extent we see it through a nonpartisan lens. Because some of my colleagues across the aisle who I talked about this, will say, look, I get it. If you represent West Virginia, I represent suburban Illinois. Moving money from your district to my district is never something you're going to vote for. But let's find a way to figure out, since if we can agree that this makes a bigger pie, let's find a way to make sure that you get a slice, right? And a lot of the conversations around environmental justice, that's a part of that conversation that we need to have. And again, the Biden administration is having it. But the challenge with the filibuster being the block, is that we can only do things through reconciliation that have a budget impact. And so there's a whole lot of things that I have a fair degree of confidence will be in some kind of infrastructure package. Huge build out of EV charging, huge build out of electric transmission. Maybe if we can find a way to get it done through reconciliation, a clean energy standard that would get us to zero carbon by 2035, 2040 in the power sector. By the way, getting to that requires the construction of about 1,100 gigawatts of electric generation. For context, we currently have 1,000 gigawatts of electric generation. So we're talking massive scale investments, coast to coast broadband, which is a big deal because it's, for getting to that infrastructure of the future and making sure we can control these devices and be efficient, you have to do there. In the tax bill that I expect will be a part of this, I think we will probably have a bill that I've led with Earl Blumenauer to get rid of all the tax subsidies to the oil and gas industry. Big deal, right? Hugely levels the playing field. And those things can go through. What's hard is that reconciliation is not the best tool to make policy changes. And the stuff that we're going to do, if we're going to do everything that needs to be done, really needs to unleash the private sector as well. And so things like there's a provision to create a single federal agency that would control transmission siting, because it's really, really hard to build transmission in this country because there's so many permitting agencies. And it's really hard to think about electrifying our vehicle fleet and making our whole electric generation fleet clean and not having to build up wires to connect them, right? So the Biden administration has recognized that. They're proposing setting up a single agency that's got sort of, you still would have all the rights to sort of contest a siting decision, but just have a single agency that controls the whole process. That's not really a budget line item. So if we have to go through reconciliation, I'm not sure that would survive, which makes us more dependent on federal money to solve this than private capital, that's not ideal from a policy outcome, but it's because of the darn filibuster. In the near term, though, we are getting an awful lot done through executive action, which isn't the best way to get it done, but it does matter, right? We're back in Paris. We're going to go to Glasgow. I went to Madrid last year, and the U.S. delegation to Madrid were Democratic members of Congress because the executive branch wasn't there. Well, now we're going back to Glasgow this year, and we'll go again as the Democratic members of Congress, but we will be joined by John Kerry, by Gina McCarthy, by a full delegation working to lead, because as one of the European parliamentarians said to me when we were there, when the United States doesn't lead, bad things happen. right? And that has a particular resonance for a European parliamentarian, but we know it's true, right? So we've got this opportunity to be there. I expect we will join the Network for Greening the Financial System shortly, which is all of the G7 finance ministers trying to make sure that we have a consistent set of rules for how do we account for contributions to climate change? How do we make sure that if you buy clean electricity from me and I'm in a different country, and then you sell a product to somebody in a third country, who owns the title to the carbon credit, right? These are solvable problems, but they have to be done, and that's a part of what's being done at Glasgow. The other thing that's been happening, just purely as a personal level, which is kind of fun, is I introduced a bill and got it passed in financial services, the climate financial risk disclosure, which would direct the Securities and Exchange Commission to require all companies to have a consistent and mandatory reporting of their contributions to climate change, their exposure to a warming planet, their governance structure against that, and then separately introduced a bill that we haven't gotten through committee yet to have our financial regulators treat climate change as a systemic risk and make sure that we know where capital flows are going to move through the system. Because if money does move from West Virginia to Illinois in this transition, what happens to the bank in West Virginia? How do we make sure that they've got appropriate buffers, that there isn't a run on that bank? The stuff that needs to be done. Well, we did all that, and then exactly the way it doesn't happen in Schoolhouse Rock, Biden signed an executive order, and now Janet Yellen is implementing all that stuff along with Chairman Gensler, and that's not the way that I thought a bill became a law, but that stuff is now happening. And so you've got a lot of changes in the financial system that are going to have the practical effect of taking away a lot of these current barriers to clean energy deployment, because it will expose some of the ways that we currently subsidize dirtier, more expensive fuel. So there's a lot that's going to happen. It's going to happen through big muscle movements in infrastructure and somewhat wonky, nerdy executive action. And the question is really, are we going to get enough done quickly enough to bend the curve? Because we aren't doing that yet. And if we're honest about ourselves, we know we have to work way harder, because we're about 30 years too late on starting this process, and we got to make up for lost time. But I'm cautiously optimistic, and let me stop there. Hopefully, I've thrown enough ideas out for to trigger some questions, and eager to hear your thoughts. And however you want to run the rest of this, Jeff, the floor is open.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean. That's good stuff. It sounds like some things are happening. Note to everyone out there who's listening, submit your questions via chat. I think that's the easiest way, rather than unmuting yourself. So go ahead, and we'll be monitoring those. And Mark, if you want to take a look at those too. I'll just pop in with the first one. So Sean, you mentioned that, the Republicans have the states with the land. And, I wonder if one way to get some of them on board, and I saw a couple as I was looking through some of the bills that are out there, some of them had to do with climate change and agriculture. I would think that there is, awareness, at least, of some in the agricultural community that climate's affecting crop growing, and there are areas where there are drought and shrinking water tables and that kind of thing. I mean, is there any hope of getting Republicans on board in agriculturally oriented states, because they're hearing from their constituents?
So I think there's a lot of things that could be done agriculturally, and there certainly is a lot of value that can come. I mean, look, if farmers could get paid for agricultural practices that make for better soil carbon retention, that's a big deal. I think sometimes we make a little bit too much of that electorally. The agricultural sector, it creates a lot of wealth for the economy, but it doesn't employ nearly as many people as it used to, right? One person in a modern tractor can manage a lot of acres.
Right.
It didn't used to be the case. And the challenge, and the reason why I say that, the Republicans represent land and the Democrats represent people. I represent 740,000 people, give or take, in the 6th District of Illinois. Wyoming has about 500,000 people in it. They have one member of Congress, Liz Cheney, and 2 senators. The land of Wyoming is vastly overrepresented relative to its people. Right. And those, for those 500,000 people, you know, oil and gas and coal exploration is a big part of that economy. But it accrues to the owners of the land, not the farmers, right? And that's, so that challenge is there.
Yeah. Mark, it looks like we got some questions on chat. You want to jump in with something for Sean?
Yeah, let's see. Let me make sure I'm getting off mute here. There's several things. Could you please explain the basics? Reconciliation is a budget process, right? The filibuster symbolizes the need for a larger number of people to be required to pass a bill. So why doesn't everything needed go in a budget plan to fight and compromise?
Okay. So number one, if you didn't see it, go on we did a whole town hall on the filibuster, and I won't try to repeat all that, but with Adam Gentleson, read his book, Kill Switch. Our founders never intended the filibuster to exist. Alexander Hamilton and James Madison both argued pretty strongly against anything that would require supermajority control. The filibuster does not require that you need a supermajority of people to pass a law. The filibuster requires that you need a supermajority of people to agree to vote on a law. It's really pernicious. If you can get through the filibuster, getting the votes, all you need is 51. But you can't break through the 60 vote threshold for the filibuster. There was a recognition in Congress a long time ago that I think there's a broad recognition, even in the Senate, that it's a really, really dumb rule. And so over time, they've passed these little exceptions. Mitch McConnell did an exception, you may recall, so that he could get some Supreme Court justices passed. He said, I'm never going to get these horrible justices passed without the filibuster. And so nobody has ever become a Supreme Court justice with a thinner majority than Brett Kavanaugh, because everybody hated him, but they could get a straight party line vote. By the way, the previous record holder for that was Neil Gorsuch. In a prior era, there was a recognition that once we pass a budget, there are sometimes needs to change funding that is consistent with the intent of the budget, and you shouldn't have to go through all the filibuster. So in what's called the Byrd Rule, named after former Senator Byrd from West Virginia, if you are if you are simply reallocating funding within the construct of an existing budget, then you can go through a 50 vote threshold through what's called reconciliation. It's a parliamentary thing. It's goofy. It has nothing to do with our founders' intent, but it is the rules of the Senate. And so what's happened, the way we got the American Rescue Plan through and the way we could get the infrastructure plan through, the American Rescue Plan was done by passing a budget for the current fiscal year and then tweaking within that budget. We need to do a budget for the next fiscal year. So we are now working on a budget for the next fiscal year, which would include a fairly healthy spend on infrastructure. And once that budget is passed, we can then push this through the reconciliation process. But that's why I was saying before that you can only use reconciliation to things that affect the federal budget. So going through and saying, you may recall the parliamentarian said you can't raise the minimum wage through budget reconciliation because that affects what the private sector pays. It doesn't affect the federal budget, and that was the parliamentarian's rule. And the parliamentarian is like Moses, it's on stone tablets and you can't debate it. So that's, and I'm sorry, it's wonky, but if you read through the lines that I have opinions on the filibuster, you're probably reading through those lines correctly.
Sean, here's one. Go ahead, Mark. You got something else?
I recall reading about the House of Lords in England used to do exactly the same kind of obstruction, and they finally defanged them so they can't do that anymore. They still have their problems in English Parliament, but anyway, That's there. So Jeff, go ahead.
Well, it's worth noting just on that point, Alexander Hamilton, one of the Federalist Papers, I think it was like Federalist 14, said that supermajorities create the problems they're designed to solve. Because the whole idea that our founders had was that we're going to have really hard problems, resolve them by deferring to the will of the majority. And imposing supermajority thresholds essentially says we're going to resolve them subject to the will of the minority. Right?
Crazy.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Here's one, Sean. What is the real likelihood of reducing fossil fuel subsidies?
I have fairly good confidence it will be part of the tax package that'll be put together. I don't think this is something that gets passed on on a straight vote just on that standalone bill on the floor. But I think there are ways to get that done, or at least part of it done, as part of a big omnibus bill. I mean, that's how you get things done that are necessary but are hard to see your way to a majority given some of the regional interests, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll see it, but as part of a larger tax package that has enough things that everybody wants to claim a victory and vote for it.
Okay. Mark?
We got another one. John Glenn wrote into everyone. I just read Bill Gates' book on the climate problem. What's the best way to get involved in the mission along with you?
You know what I tell everybody is that I think the important thing to recognize about this is that if you have Bill Gates' lifestyle and really big homes and maybe a private jet or two and you know all that goes with that, or if you are completely impoverished third world living in a mud hut on $1 a day, in either event, your individual impact on climate change is a rounding error, right? What we do as individuals, if all we do is just our individual actions, is not significant. That's not to say you shouldn't turn off the light when you leave the room. It's not to say you shouldn't recycle. But the most impactful thing that any of us can do is to figure out how to leverage larger groups of people. In my line of work, I can do it by passing laws. In my prior line of work, I could do it by building a company that built things. I was meeting with some students recently out at IMSA, out in Aurora, the Illinois Math and Science Academy, and they asked the question, and we sat there and said, I bet you could probably find $500,000 of things in your school that would pay for themselves and save money, and then put that together, get the list together, and then write a letter to all your rich IMSA donors and say, hey, we found these projects. Would you donate to get this thing done? So, and that sort of emerged from a brainstorming session. But, what's the group and network that you live in, and how do you leverage that group? Because we got to get everybody rowing in the same direction.
Here's one. The National Renewable Energy Lab study relative to East versus West energy grid has huge potential. Anything happening there?
The SEEN study, love the SEEN study. That report was totally suppressed by the prior administration, and now we finally have folks at the Department of Energy who are doing it. Yeah, the study is basically going through to recognize that there are deploying renewable energy at scale really requires a much more interconnected grid, because it's always windy somewhere. It's usually sunny somewhere, like with a couple exceptions out of this day, but we don't have connections all across the country. And what that NREL report did was identify a handful of really key bottlenecks that by boosting transmission capacity in these regions, we could really unleash a much more interconnected grid. And it's a really important study. Part of that is just deploying the capital, and DOE is doing a good job of promulgating that. The harder part is that it really comes down to FERC, because most of the, I don't want to say most, a lot of the participants in the electric power industry have a vested interest in being in a node that's very congested, because they can make more money if you have an asset in that node. And so there are some disincentives within a lot of the market participants in debottlenecking the system. And none of them will say that quite so explicitly, but some of the market rules for access, which Chairman Glick at FERC has been really understands and has been a nice job of pushing, because they've been trying to do this for a while, and we're just finding that even when you put all the incentives in place, people aren't really building those wires that debottleneck these areas, and that's a market structure and largely a market governance problem, which is fixable, but that's got to be fixed at FERC.
And the Texas legislature still didn't do anything, but then they only meet a little time every 2 years. So
well, you realize we do have 3 grids in this country. There's East, West, and Texas. And I would point out, when all that bad weather came to Texas, the same weather was in El Paso. El Paso is also part of Texas. El Paso never lost power because El Paso is a part of the Western interconnect.
Bingo. Next question. Do you think that incentivizing regenerative agricultural practices should be directed at the 2023 Farm Bill, and where do we start with that?
So really good question, and I'm not a farmer, so I don't have a great answer to that. But I've certainly been involved in a lot of really interesting conversations with this with some of my colleagues on the climate committee. And the challenge is how do I put this succinctly? You can look at these practices in a vacuum, whether it's cover cropping or no-till practices, biochar, other soil amendments. You can look at them in a vacuum and say, this has a huge impact on carbon retention in the soil. And if we did all this, it would lead to this much more carbon in the soil. It's really, really hard, on the other hand, to say, if you do this on your farm, this is the precise tonnage of CO2 that will be stored, and here's the durability of that storage. And by the way, you're going to commit to not disturb your soil that might break it out later, or change water flows or something else. And so while I think there's an intellectual case to be made for paying farmers for the amount of carbon they reduce, I think the practical legislative fix is probably more around identifying those practices that we'd like to encourage farmers to use and then rewarding those practices. So as an example, there's a real interesting program in Iowa that I think Illinois has just adapted, where if you put cover crops on, they'll reduce your crop insurance per acre that you do cover crops on. And so it's directly tied to sort of income streams the farmer already has. You can tie that out, and you sort of say, we know there'll be carbon benefits, but we'll deal with that separately. I think the challenge with that is that most of the farmers and agriculture groups I talk to get a little bit nervous when a dude in a suit in Washington says, I'd like to recommend some new agricultural practices. And so I think there's some really good groups that are really, focused on farmers, run by farmers, understand agricultural issues, who are leading the push to sort of figure out, like, how do you solve what at some level is a marketing problem, and then make sure that the policies we recommend make sense in that context. So I don't have all the answers to it, but certainly some of my colleagues, Shelley Pingree from Maine is really good on this, really thoughtful. Cindy Axney from Iowa has been doing some interesting stuff. So and I defer to their leadership. They're smarter on these things than I are, but it is a marketing and communications problem.
I've heard that electric cars are still an environmental hazard and that hybrids are a safer bet. Yes, no?
No, I would disagree with that. I think unless you're on a grid that is 100% coal-fired, which basically doesn't exist in the United States anymore, the fuel efficiency of an electric car is so much higher than something with a gasoline engine, that you're just going to be way better for your operating hours. Now the manufacturing, there are certainly reasonable concerns about how much cobalt and lithium do we have in the world, and what's the manufacturing process for those, and are those sustainable? And at the end of the day, taking any finite resource out of the earth and moving it around has an environmental impact, right? We're not going to change that. But oh, by the way, that's also true for steel and aluminum and all the things that are in an internal combustion engine. And there's the old saw in biology that everything is poisonous. It's just a function of the dosage. So all the well-to-wheels analysis that I've seen, many that I did back in a prior life, is that going to full electric is an overall net positive, especially as the grid decarbonizes. We will develop some other environmental issues that we have to deal with, but as far as climate change goes, it's a huge positive.
Next question, is there any appetite for directing the money subsidy for making renewable energy to those states and cities that currently make fossil fuels? Make those people wealthy while making environment clean.
Absolutely. So there's the broad environmental justice conversation, and I'm realizing that I should pull my shade. I don't mean to have such a halo effect on me. The broad environmental justice conversation is really talking about two groups of people that we need to make sure that we're looking out for. The first is communities of color, people in historically disadvantaged communities, tribal groups who have historically been taken advantage of. They're the people who we've built the polluting factories next to. and try to make sure that as we clean up the economy, we look out for them. And that's part one. Part two is what do you do with all those regions of the country that depend on fossil production for energy? And that was what I was saying before, this wealth transfer from energy producers to energy consumers. We need to think about a way to facilitate that transition. And it is terrific that we're talking about it. It's terrific that there are people from those who represent those communities advocating for their interests, because they have not always advocated for them. Keep in mind, the coal industry employs a fraction of the people they employed 100 years ago. And it's not because of renewables. It's because we largely automated coal mining. And none of the people who represented coal miners were out there saying, well, we can't do mountaintop removal, we can't do longwall mining until we figure out some way to get wealth back to the displaced coal miners, right? They should have, and it's appropriate for us to do that now, and I'm glad we're doing it. And most of the bills that we're going through have some conversation on there, but I will say it's a hard issue, right? I mean, how do you? I think we can be a little bit patronizing when we say we'll just send you back to community college to learn a new skill. If you're 55 years old, you've been working on an oil derrick all your life, you've got some really sophisticated skills, you've got some significant experience that's hard to replace, and you've got your family and your life and your sense of community tied to that sense of place. And saying, well, how would you like to move halfway across the country and go to community college to learn thin film deposition so you can build solar panels? It's a bit patronizing, right? Not to say that we shouldn't make that opportunity available to those who want it, but we do have to think about what do you do to give those people some dignity in this transition. Some of you may have heard me say this before, we feed a lot more people because we industrialized agriculture in this country. That was a good thing for us as a society, and it doesn't change the fact that the second half of Ma Jode's life was pretty crummy, right? And so how do we not have a grapes of wrath situation, even as we embrace these technologies that are going to clean our air and give us a healthier planet and leave our kids both, healthier, safer, and richer, right?
So, Sean, earlier you were talking about the problems with the filibuster and the need to get an infrastructure bill through with reconciliation. Do you think that Joe Manchin will vote for another reconciliation bill?
That is the central Sphinx-like question of Washington right now. It is. I had theories on that, and my theories of that change by the day. I think, and Joe Manchin, to some degree, leave aside whatever you think of him as a person, West Virginia is going to be hard set by this transition, right? And what's even harder for West Virginia, if we're really honest, like if you've not been to West Virginia, I encourage you to go. It is a spectacularly beautiful state. A part of the reason it's so spectacularly beautiful is because its geography is such that, but for the coal mines, you'd be a fool to build anything there. The hills are really, really steep. It's pretty intimidating terrain. And, as those extractive industries go away in West Virginia, there's a lot of those communities that are probably going to become ghost towns, right? It's hard to get broadband to there. It's hard to get roads to there. Their source of wealth, the mine, if the mine runs out or we stop taking stuff out of the mine, it's hard. And, I think in some abstract sense, we can say, let's look out for every American, regardless of where they live, and give them opportunities to move around. But those of us who represent those Americans, we don't represent them wherever they move to. We represent them if they happen to live in a certain geographic area, right? And that's a challenge for the Manchins of the world, right? Because he's not advocating at some level. He's not, nor should he advocate for the people he represents. He's advocating for the communities he represents, right? People can move, but the communities are in a tough way.
Right.
So I have sympathy for him, even as I detest the filibuster.
Next question. Isn't investing in public transportation a more climate-friendly option than putting more cars on the road, regardless of whether they're electric or hybrid?
Oh, I think it's an and, not an or, right? I mean, the certainly if we had a clean sheet of paper, we could save a ton of money and a ton of energy by having denser population centers and good transit that gets out to the suburban areas and tying sort of that European layout, right? We don't have a clean sheet of paper, right? We do have people living in, I don't know, Plainfield, right? As an example, or maybe Kankakee, right? We don't have the kind of dense population centers, and so at least for the foreseeable future, we're going to need some mix of dramatically increasing the efficiency of individual vehicles. But I think at the same time, let's invest in rail, let's invest in mass transit, let's think about the kinds of zoning decisions we can make to incentivize people to live in a little bit denser environments. But I don't think you can change that overnight.
If anyone else has questions for Sean, please type them into the chat right now.
If I could put one in while maybe people are waiting. I know that Citizens Climate Lobby wants a carbon fee and dividend. The Food and Water Watch people say that's never worked. We're not supporting of that. So what's the state of current climate legislation, and where are you putting your cards on the deck?
Well, so I must say the general conversation on carbon pricing is very frustrating to me, because it's very hard to see a path for any carbon pricing bill getting through, with a sort of an exception. And some of you have heard me do this spiel before. I have my own carbon pricing bill that I'm very fond of. I won't bore you with all the details right now, but the idea of controlling pollution by putting a price on the externality of pollution and allowing markets to figure out how to allocate capital in response to that price is a deeply, deeply Republican idea. It actually emerged out of the Reagan White House. Bill Ruckelshaus house, who was the second chief of EPA, developed that. It became the Montreal Protocol, was implemented to put a price on chlorofluorocarbons in the Montreal Protocol by Bill Riley, who succeeded him in the first George Bush White House. They then passed the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act that did the same for acid rain. So we have structures in this country that put a price on a pollutant and let markets balance supply and demand by creating a structure where the source has to pay the sink and they negotiate a price subject to a declining cap. That was a Republican idea out of the Reagan White House, right? And it worked, and it continues to work. We were supposed to do that on carbon, and those same people were starting to work on what became Kyoto. And then Clinton came in, Gingrich said, I'm going to hate on you just because you're not a Republican, and the whole thing got demonized. I share that history because we have, with the exception I would submit of the bill that I've introduced, none of the structures we have to price carbon actually follow that successful model. We have approaches that say the sources have to pay. That's a carbon tax. We have structures that say the sinks will get paid. That's a renewable portfolio standard. It's a clean energy standard. Every cap and trade we've proposed has so many exemptions for existing polluters that we take so many sources out that it doesn't meet that. And we could go on down all the other flavors of this. What's hard is that because there's fundamentally no support across the aisle for any kind of price on carbon, getting something through to the floor and passing would require 100% of the Democrats to be on board with one flavor. There are some who like carbon tax. There are some who like clean energy standard. There's some who like my idea of mating them together. There's some who like the idea of saying, let's put a price and then use the proceeds to give everybody a dividend, right? There's no sort of fulcrum around that comes around one of those. And Democratic leadership has not really prioritized that. I wish they would have, but they've not really prioritized it. So we need carbon pricing. I think it's a great structure. I think we have models that we should remind ourselves all the time were developed in a very bipartisan fashion. The Montreal Protocol was approved by the Senate with like 83 votes to 4 or something like that, right? But we should use those models and copy them because we know they work, and not just been on a whole cloth. But I think for the balance of this term, I think there is a consensus around a clean energy standard, which would be a payment to sources. Or I'm sorry, a payment to the carbon sinks. But doing it in a proper pro-market way is unfortunately just not there right now. Wish it was.
Sean, Donna's telling us that we have time, that you have time for one more question, one
Okay.
last question. So can we expect tax breaks for buying an electric car?
That is a good question. You know, the last one, they ended up accruing so much to the manufacturers that the Tesla made a lot of money off those tax breaks. And I am, off the top of my head, I don't recall, I'm not on the Ways and Means Committee, so all the moving pieces around the tax bill. I don't recall if there are tax credits for the EV. There are definitely tax breaks for the installation of EV charging facilities, whether for your personal use or otherwise. We are introducing a bill that I introduced last term, and we're going to bring it back this term with Senator Whitehouse on the Senate side to bring back feebates, which is set up so we say we look at the median fuel economy of any vehicle in the country, and we look at on miles per gallon equivalent. So if you're, you know, when I have a Tesla and it says that I have 156 miles to gallon equivalent, but you look at the median vehicle sold, and the more efficient you are relative to that vehicle, the bigger the rebate you get at purchase. And if you are less efficient than that median, the bigger the premium you pay at purchase. And it's structured so that it essentially pays for itself. If you want to buy a Hummer, like, that's fine, but you're going to pay a lot of money to subsidize the person buying the Chevy Volt, right? And we will be reintroducing that bill later this term. It's not expressly through tax. That would just be the price you pay that's the sticker price of the car that factors in. What I personally like about it is that because we've structured it on the median, you never have to reset it, because if more people buy an efficient vehicle, as a result, the median will go down, and the next year the standard moves. So you just keep ratcheting up the efficiency. And it's been fun talking about it with some of the auto manufacturers, because we say, like, you can argue all you want that CAFE is too aggressive, you'll never be able to get there. I'll stipulate you're right. All I'm asking is, do you think it's possible of you to be better than half your competitors?
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. Sounds good. So, well, Sean, we want to thank you very much for your time. Mark, any last thoughts from you?
Just Sean, let us know how we can help on what you're trying to do, and keep us in the loop, and we'll have Don Black get back to us, I guess.
Awesome. Pleasure to see you all. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Sean.
Take care.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for your participation, and recording will be posted. Thanks.